We will pass to Will Taylor, who will speak about horses, donkeys, and the Anthropocene in the indigenous Mississippian world. William Taylor is an archaeologist and researcher, also at the Max Planck Institute for the Science of Human History in Jena. He was born and raised in Montana. His research explores the ways that horses and other domestic animals have how horses and other domestic animals have impacted human societies and human history around the globe. He is a National Geographic Young Explorer and has received his PhD from the University of New Mexico in 2017. His research has been funded by the National Science Foundation, National Geographic, the US Fulbright Student Research Program, and a number of other international and national agencies. Will Taylor's work on early horse culture in Mongolia and Central Asia has been featured by CNN and Science Magazine, so you should know him already, even if you don't listen to his talk today. And he's published in leading journals throughout the world. So, Will, please take the floor.
All right, well, thank you for that lovely, if perhaps slightly exaggerated introduction. See if the clicker here is working. Dr. Spengler had a couple of issues. So I'll be talking to you today about our research on the role of horses and just a tiny little bit about donkeys in this part of the world and perhaps how they fit into this bigger picture of the Anthropocene. In general, the domestication of the horse was really one of the most transformative events in human history. And though for many of us today, this is actually, I didn't take it, but it's outside the hotel that many of you might be staying at. Our day-to-day interaction with horses may be limited to these kind of novelty, carriage rides or weekend out on a dude ranch. It was actually not very long ago at all that horses were sort of at the core of nearly every aspect of the infrastructure in our lives, whether it be agriculture, military, communication. This is a map of the short-lived, if nonetheless important, Pony Express, which famously linked one of the early mail systems that linked the western United States. And in fact, in many areas of the world, including Mongolia, where I do some of my field work, as well as areas of the western US, horses are at the center of not just culture, and are not only important as a form of transport, but are actually crucially significant as a livestock animal and basic elements of the economy. In fact, in this part of the world, the kind of Mississippi region, as well as across the globe, horses have been responsible, at least anecdotally, for some really incredible social transformations. And so this image here shows some mounted hunters, Oto hunters from Nebraska, engaging. This is a kind of historic journal image by a pretty artistic fellow from the early 1800s. But these folks are engaged in a bison hunt. Horses transformed the cultures of the Mississippian world, particularly the eastern plains, so kind of the western edge of the Mississippi Basin in terms of not only their culture, but their social structure. Here we have, you can see changes to the kind of economic system, the emergence of the importance of bison hunts, the way people moved around the landscape, when they moved, why they moved. And so potentially horses are responsible for quite a number of crucial social transformations. Sorry, here. I'm trying to move forward. Where are we pointing here? That will help. Okay. And that the complexity of the potential social transformations linked with horses owe to the fact that they are not simply, a military tool or a way to get around, but they're an animal. So they are responsible. They link in with people in a number of different ways in terms of how people acquire food, how people communicate. And so as you can see, this diagram, what I want you to take away is just the diversity of potential roles associated with horses and the complexity of the different ways in which they may interact with one another. Oops, that's not a nice animation. Okay, horses are also an animal. They are one of the world's largest herbivores, and the way that their stomachs are designed, they are basically very, very inefficient at digesting grasses. So they just move around. They move around and they eat a lot of plants. And so they are also an incredibly important transformative force environmentally and ecologically. What you see here is a patch of grass in Australia where horses were introduced very recently, you know, in the 18th century, where they put a little fence in here to keep out what they call, it's a kind of a cute Aussie word, brumbies. But these are basically just wild horses, and this is a plot where they've decided to fence them out, and you can see the impacts that wild horse grazing can have environmentally and ecologically as well. Horses have other kinds of impacts as well, and one of those, both horses and donkeys played a critical role as a connective force, linking peoples and cultures and organisms across different parts of the world that, you know, prior to horse and donkey transportation might have been kind of more separate spheres. And so through the work of colleagues like Dr. Spengler, we know that these animals played a crucial role in bringing different... Which direction were you successful in? Okay, different domestic plants, for example, between the China and the territories of Central Asia, the ancient, you know, separate spheres of Eurasia, where different domestic plants like wheat and barley on the one hand, rice, fruits, horses and donkeys were this incredibly important connective force linking these different regions as a form of transportation as well. And so horses have played a crucial role in kind of dispersing other organisms besides people and besides themselves. Okay, and moving forward. Unfortunately, so I think what we can appreciate from looking at this is just how incredibly important, but also how incredibly complex you know, horses and their potential impact on the world that we live in today may have been. And one of the most difficult aspects of trying to understand those processes and their effects is the fact that the horses are a grassland animal, and many of the cultures, peoples, and regions that they have most greatly impacted leave very little in the historic records, and they leave an archaeological record which can look something like this. So this is a site in southeastern Montana where I'm from, but this is a habitation site associated with you know, a kind of horse-based way of life. And you can see that, you know, this often means that folks are moving around great distances, not spending any particular time in a particular place, and leaving quite ephemeral transitory archaeological deposits. And so they're not leaving us a lot of material with which we can kind of apply a scientific mode of inquiry in order to understand how, when, and why, you know, some of these transformations may have occurred. And so the driving force behind my work and behind you know, the Mississippi element of this research project is how can we use archaeological science in an interdisciplinary way, working with other kinds of data sets, to understand the role of equids in shaping our modern world. And luckily for us, we do have one regularly significant data set with which we can use to kind of start to build inferences about these really important questions. And those are the bones of animals themselves from archaeological sites. And so this is a discipline that you might call archaeozoology, and it just simply means the scientific study of animal remains from these sites. But pretty much across the globe, whether we're talking about here in the kind of greater Mississippi or in the great, you know, steppes of Eurasia in the Old World, both as kind of trash deposits and as, you know, ritually important features, we get a lot of bones of horses and also donkeys. You can kind of mentally add and donkeys to every time I say horses, because I pretty much focus very strongly on horses, but would like to, you'll see our hopes for expanding this line of inquiry into their neglected brethren. And so a lot of my early work is focused on how can we take these deposits, which are not uncommon, but they don't necessarily have a lot of direct, obvious implications for human activity. So one of the lines of evidence that one of the focus of our work has been developing ways in which we can trace human activity or trace the significance of horses using nothing but their skeletal material. And I'm not going to go into any of this here, but I would be happy to follow up with you afterwards. Some of the things we've been able to trace is, for example, equipment using deformations to the skeletal remains of horses caused by, here you can see a nice little divot caused by a bridle here. Anatomical indicators that may tell us about how an animal was used. We had a paper coming out where we identified these funny changes to the nasal bones, which are caused by really prolonged periods of heavy exertion, right, through comparing modern natural history collections. And then there's a number of different activities which we've been able to trace in terms of the management and care of horses through osteology. Here we have a couple of grab bag of images from a paper that came out this year where we identified kind of the origins of veterinary dentistry and sophisticated veterinary care of horses by studying teeth of horses from archaeological context. So this kind of traditional, this gentleman today is using a screwdriver, this kind of traditional but relatively sophisticated form of veterinary care, which is something we traced in Mongolia and can explore using nothing but osteological remains. We also have been expanding this work into not just osteology, but kind of a biomolecular side. So by doing this precision, Dr. Spengler mentioned Bayesian statistical modeling of radiocarbon dates, we've been able to produce a kind of a high-resolution model for the spread of domestic horses in Mongolia and the eastern steppes of Eurasia. And one of the really important and useful reasons for doing that is that once we are armed with this sophisticated kind of geographically oriented chronology, we can then do a much better job of linking in the introduction of horses or their spread among peoples with changes, environmental changes. So for example, in Mongolia, we were able to determine that the adoption of domestic horses was not linked with drought, as many people had said, and also was linked with some pretty widespread evidence for vegetational changes to the landscape, deforestation, and the introduction of expansion of the role of other kinds of livestock. So bringing this all to the important question that has us in the room today is how can we use this to understand the Mississippi region, which is an area where we are not simply grasping at straws, or in this case, horse bones, but we actually have quite a long tradition of rich historic records to draw upon. And I'll get back to this in a minute in terms of why it's been useful to branch out into other kinds of data sets. But I'll just give you a little taste of the kinds of information which have been coming out of this project and what their significance might be. Again, if I can continue to get my clicker to cooperate. So here's just an example of try to give you a sense of the scope of the region that we're talking about and the we're really talking about essentially all of America except the boring coastal margins when we talk about the Mississippi region. And so the geographic scope of this project really is quite big, and we've really only just gotten started. You can see a lot of red dots, especially in the proper Mississippi region. This is areas which we've only recently started to work particularly with funding from this project. But some of the things we've been able to trace, for example, is by looking at the osteology, we can identify not just when an animal was ridden, but even sometimes the kind of equipment which was being used. So here are some very, very early horse specimens which come from the kind of eastern margin of the Great Plains, Nebraska and Kansas, which we can tell were used with metal bridle equipment, with a metal bit. because of characteristic changes to the teeth. And by using precision scientific dating, we actually get a sense of exactly when this was, and then we can link that in, with our understanding of, the dynamics of Spanish occupation of the Americas, cultural changes which are happening in this part of the world at this time. And so this is quite a useful line of inquiry. Another thing, and this is quite a messy, difficult to understand diagram, but another thing we've been able to trace is the way that horsemanship and horse herding might interface with both kind of traditional and European introduced agricultural systems. So this is dietary carbon isotopes. And basically what this allows us to do is, as Dr. Spengler mentioned, trace the potential impact of particular kinds of plants based on their photosynthetic pathway using remnant traces in the bone. And in what we see here in this gray kind of arc here, this kind of Milky Way on the graph, this is the natural variation in kind of C3 versus C4 photosynthesis in grasses as you go kind of by latitude. So on the far right you have Montana, on the far left you have New Mexico, and you can see that there's a natural variation in this. And what we've been doing is basically measuring the level of these isotopes in our horse bones, and then plotting them here to kind of identify deviations from the natural trend, which could be linked potentially with dietary inputs caused by a domestic crop or another. So we identified, for example, some coming from New Mexico and others coming from the Mississippian region, like sites Omaha, Osage, Pawnee sites, which are coming from this part of the world. And one potential, we're just diving into exploring this, but one potential source of these deviations from the natural pattern may be the use of maize, for example, on the one hand, which is a kind of a C4 crop, and wheat, which is an introduced, European domesticate, which would be going in the other direction. So we're beginning to explore these in greater detail. And one of the biggest issues with identifying horses and their even more neglected equine brethren, the donkey, is that they show up in archaeological sites sometimes in the ones and the twos, right? So if you're reading archaeological literature, you'll find a big list of all the beautiful fauna which are identified, and then a couple of bones at the end that say, these are equus, and we don't know if they're modern or what, but there were two of them, so we just left them alone, right? And so one of the things that's been really crucial to our research is taking piles of bone that look like this, where most of it is morphologically, unidentifiable or useless, and using some advances in technology to use, for example, the structure of collagen itself to identify, okay, we've got equus here, and then pair that with some relatively cheap, high throughput ancient DNA techniques to pin down, for example, when we've got a donkey versus a horse bone, and then we can then identify, date, and target those bones for additional kinds of analyses like I've shown you here. And one of the reasons for doing this in a time period where we have such a rich historical record is that a lot of the kind of status quo of how this question, in terms of when horses and donkeys were introduced, how they were integrated into indigenous societies, has been answered primarily by the discipline of history. And again, not to cast this, I know we have a lot of historians in the room, not to cast aspersions, but this can kind of look like, Napoleon's invasion of Russia or something, in terms of a lot of treating horses as if the spread was a kind of a linear chronological one, right? And without a detailed integration into environmental data, an understanding of horses' role as a livestock animal and their ecological significance. And so we hope to kind of replace that with this kind of, more empirically derived radiocarbon model, which you can see some of our early results here, which are providing some results that may speak to some gaps in the historical record, right? So you can see there's a lot of arrows here that don't have a date, and in fact, what we're finding out is that the dates coming back are often quite a bit earlier than you might have guessed purely from historical records, and that's because this is probably beyond the leading edge of European observers writing things down in their diary, right? A lot of the important transformations may have just missed the edge of historical documents. And then so what we're able to do with that Bayesian framework is then build in things like assumptions which we can draw from oral histories, or we can build in constraints drawn from historical records. A nice useful one, for example, is, well, we know this must be after 1492 because of Christopher Columbus, this kind of thing. But using that framework, we're able to build in a lot of different kinds of data sets which we have nicely available to us from this time period. And then our hope is that ultimately we'll be able to use that sophisticated chronology in conjunction with this detailed picture of subsistence and management, which is coming from other data sets, to link in with the sense of environmental changes. So in the St. Louis region, how did the introduction of horses influence the vegetation communities, this kind of thing? How did it relate to large-scale climate processes? And how might these processes relate to important cultural developments? So for example, in southwestern Wyoming, we're finding out that there's evidence of horse pastoralism in this region that was the potential source area for Comanche folks before they moved down to the southwest and the southern plains. So potentially that switch to pastoralism might have played a key role in that population movement. So these are the kind of questions that we're hoping to ask. And one of the longer-term ambitions here is we're actually, with each of our specimens, screening them as well for good DNA preservation. And so in cases where we have high-quality genomic data, we actually are able to explore things like the coat color of a horse, or the origins of these special indigenous breeds of horse, which emerged at a later period. And then we're hoping to actually explore not just the influence of Spanish horses, but in fact, through this kind of genetic data set, the role of inputs from England, from France, even potentially from Russia. I don't think we have any German inputs into the equine gene pool, but I don't really know, as well as the dynamics of kind of trade networks that would have emerged among indigenous groups in this region as well. And we're pretty much done here, if I can get us to advance. Yeah. Okay. And so just to kind of summarize, I think that we really go back and forth here. Our results so far are pointing to revealing some things that historic documents alone might not teach us, in terms of an early and relatively rapid adoption of horses by indigenous groups in some regions, as well as a richer picture of how they were being managed and used, and how they might interface, with kind of pre-Columbian subsistence ways of life. As you can see from, for example, the dietary isotopes and the bit where we can get a sense of the role of domestic crops and equipment and technologies. And the future work, by allowing us to, especially integrate with these more sophisticated chronology models, we're going to be able to get a better sense of, hey, we may be able to identify a donkey for once, and then expand this realm of inquiry into the poor donkeys who get so often neglected. But we're going to be able to integrate it with a better understanding of broader cultural and environmental changes, and really, I think, explore in an interdisciplinary and sophisticated framework the role that both horses and donkeys may have played in kind of the large-scale anthropogenic environmental and cultural changes that have taken place in this part of the world over a very short time frame over the last couple hundred years. So, gone a bit over my time here, so.